Wow. So I am actually kind of excited to finally be able to talk about this. So previously, I put out a video talking about Roze of the Recapture and why I thought it was a bad show as of the airing of episode 9 in the international releases on Disney Plus. Well, now the entire series has aired. Um, and so I can finally talk about the entire series as a whole, and I can judge the whole series as a whole, and there are no longer any defenses for this show at all. Because there were some people saying before online, you can't judge the product until it's finished. Well, guess what? Now it's finished, and it only got worse. This show peaked at episode 2 or 3. It was okay in the beginning. It had potential, and it has done nothing. It has squandered all potential that it has, and it is now actively insulting to Code Geass as a franchise. And so I have actually a fairly long document here. I have 9 pages here that I want to go through of things that I have to say about the show, mostly not recapping what I said in my previous video, although all of that still applies. But this will be a 2-part thing. So part of it is me railing against the series and the defense of the series, but the other part will be my suggestions for how this series could have been better. Because I don't want to just hate on this show and not offer any constructive feedback. I think there were some good ideas in this show, and I do love Code Geass, and I think this could have been good even within the kind of poorly conceived idea of Neo Britannia. So in part 2 of this, I will discuss changes that I think could be made without dramatically altering the plot. Outside of like what is given to us, I'm not adding, brand new elements. I'm not wildly changing the scope of this. Although I will modify and add or remove a few things for the sake of making my version of it work. But the first thing I want to talk about in terms of railing against the existing show is some of the defense that I saw was that people said that you need to lower your expectations for this show because of the financial reality surrounding the show and Code Geass as a franchise. And I took those things on their face at the time. But I have done a little bit of research into this now. And I no longer understand these defenses at all because they don't hold any water. The defense was basically that the movie Lelouch of the Resurrection underperformed, and so the series is not in a strong place. And the current reality of the anime landscape would not support a 24 or similar length sized series. Both of these are complete bullshit. And I do not know where people are getting these ideas from. So, for reference, Lelouch of the Resurrection made $9 million in theaters. Now, we do not know what its budget was, but generally, a movie is successful if it makes more than its budget. It is hard to imagine that the movie cost more than, say, $4 or $5 million. And I say that because Dragon Ball Super cost $8.5 million. And Dragon Ball Super had way better animation at certain points than Lelouch of the Resurrection. And it came out the same year. And of course, Dragon Ball Super went on to make $115 million, right? Because Dragon Ball is the biggest anime in the world. But the fact that this movie made almost $10 million, it made about $9 million, actually. That's an exaggeration. It made $9 million at the box office on a budget of probably $4 to $5 million means it doubled its cost. It earned twice as much as it cost to make. And on top of that, the Recap trilogy, which also aired in theaters before that movie came out and would have cost practically nothing to make because they were just re-editing the original series, that also made $4.5 million by itself. So realistically, it is entirely possible that the Recap trilogy cost basically nothing to make, made them $4.5 million in profit, and then they turned that $4.5 million into Lelouch of the Resurrection, that then made them $9 million. So the idea that the movie underperformed is insanity. And I don't know how people can possibly say this, especially because we do not know the budget. But the idea that the movie cost more to make than Dragon Ball Super Broly, sorry, I didn't specify earlier. I'm talking about the Broly movie that also released in 2019. The idea that the movie cost anywhere near as much or more than Dragon Ball Super Broly is psychotic. It did not cost that much to make. So the movie was clearly a financial success. It is a lie to claim that the movie was any kind of failure or that it underperformed. I don't believe it. And I would love to see any kind of proof or metric or evidence that it underperformed, because I don't know where that comes from. Alongside that, in terms of the length of the show and the anime landscape, just last year in 2022 to 2023, so 2 to 1 years ago, Sunrise Bandai also put out a new Gundam series, Witch from Mercury, which was a 25 episode series. It was 24 episodes plus a prologue. And that did gangbusters. It was like the most popular Gundam series ever. And it is currently like selling mad gunpla. And in that year of 2023, Bandai reported that they made $944 million primarily off of the back of Witch from Mercury. So the idea that Sunrise was in any kind of poor financial situation to not be able to afford a longer series and a better series is just not true. I don't know where these ideas come from. I don't believe it. And I don't think that the problem with Roze is its budget or its length per se. I think you could have written a good 12-episode script. It would have been hard, and you would have needed to tighten it significantly, and you would have needed to cut half of these characters. But you could have done it. It would have been possible. But that's not what they did. They wrote a 25-episode script, and they tried to shove it into 12 episodes. I don't know why. And I don't know why they did this movie approach either, because I looked up the results of the movie. I wasn't able to find how much the last movie made. But the first movie of Roze made $500,000. And then the second and third movie supposedly made about $1 million each. Now, I think that data may be a little questionable because I don't understand how or why the first movie would make so much less than the second and third. But I think it's probably fair to say each of these movies made about $1 million. And the fourth one probably also made about that much, right? Although it is also reasonable to say that the first one probably actually made the most and then it declined from there. Either way, Roze made half as much as Resurrection. So again, the idea that Resurrection was somehow a failure is just nonsensical. The real problem with Roze, as far as I can tell, is the writer. Because the writer, Ichiro Okuchi, was the writer of the original Code Geass R1, R2, the recap movies, and Resurrection, and also Gundam Witch from Mercury, all wildly financially successful, critically acclaimed series. And he had no involvement at all, as far as I can tell, in Roze of the Recapture. So the fact that Roze is seemingly doing very poorly at the box office, comparatively, and is not getting universal acclaim. It is, in fact, from people like myself, and there are others like me who hate this series and think that it is disgustingly bad. And even to people who defend it, who say it's not as good as the original series, but somehow still defend it at all. His involvement seems to be the major difference here. I don't know why he wasn't involved, and to be fair, he wasn't involved in Akito either. So maybe they just, they save him for the major projects and they don't put him on the spin-offs, or maybe he was busy writing Witch from Mercury. I'm not sure, but that is the major problem. The major problem with this series is the writing. If you had a better, more competent writer, you could have had a tight 12-episode series. But the writer of Roze, who is Noboru Kimura, does not seem to be as talented as Ichiro Okuchi. Based on a quick glance of my anime list, looking over the amount of series that they have done and the reviews of those series, it is clear that Ichiro has been involved in writing significantly more series than Noboru has, and overall, those series have been more well received than the series Noboru Kimura has been involved in. Now, obviously, neither is entirely responsible for the performance of those series, but that is certainly a trend. And when you take that with the other factors that I have given you, it suggests that a lot of the responsibility here falls on Noboru as the scriptwriter of this for not writing a very good script. So, a lot of my concerns really ultimately come down to that, is that it just was not a very good script. And pretty much everything that I'm going to talk about from here on can be boiled down to they needed a tighter script or they needed more time. It's you can have one or the other, but ideally you have both. Because, R1 of Code Geass was so wildly successful because not only did it have a tight-ass script, a very tight script, it was 24 episodes. So they had time to develop an incredibly well-written cast of characters and an interesting plot that could then be carried into R2. And here's the benefit of this. If you spend time early on developing a story, a world, and characters, and you invest the audience in those things, then if at some points in your story the writing suffers, then people are more willing to overlook those things. The reason a lot of movies fail, such as Madam Web, for instance, is because the characters are not strong enough to carry through the bad writing. Good characters can carry you through some subpar writing. There's plenty of stuff out there like that. To a certain extent, that's what R2 is, because R2 is not as tight as R1. Most people acknowledge that. Although, to be fair, the problems with R2 are greatly exaggerated. R2 is not bad at any point. It's just not as good as R1, which is certainly a high bar to reach. But because R1 was so good and because we were so invested in the story and these characters, it was unlikely that R2 turned anybody away. It's unlikely that anybody was truly upset with anything that happened in R2 because you're invested. You care. So even when the writing dipped a little bit, you were still there. You were willing to push through it, and you may not have even noticed at the time because you were there for the emotion and the characters and what was happening in the moment. And only in retrospect do you realize, hey, maybe this doesn't work out so well. And then obviously R2 had some great peaks as well. R2 had a lot of great moments as well to counterbalance the moments that were not quite as good. Roze has none of this. Roze has no time to develop a cast of characters that can carry you through the events of the story. And similarly, when it's writing dips, there's nothing to hold you to it. It's so much harder to look past the flaws in the story, and there are many flaws because there's no investment. If this show was 25 episodes and we had spent the first half of the series building up these characters and we liked these characters, and I actually could tell you anything about the members of the Seven Shining Stars, or if Catherine and Arnold and Nara were good characters, then maybe the problems that start and really surface at episode 9 would not be as bad. It would be easier to overlook them. Now, given the amount and the significance of the problems, that's a difficult scenario to imagine. But it's possible that if this show had time to spend at the maid cafe or in the palace, developing these characters and these relationships and establishing the world and answering questions about how all of this is even possible to begin with, and not relegating plot critical information to fucking Japanese theater exclusive pamphlets, then maybe all of this would have been easier to look past. But they chose a bad writer and they gave him no time to work with. So unfortunately, what we got was just a train wreck of a series. So I do have a bit of a script here, some points I want to hit. I may get a little distracted as a lot of these things kind of, these issues kind of blend together. But the first thing I want to talk about is how I think that this series just fundamentally misunderstands the original. I said in my original video that the people writing this story which is primarily Noboru Kimura and whoever is assisting him, seem to have a very shallow understanding of the series at best and no understanding of the original series at worst. And here's my points to demonstrate this. So as I mentioned, there's no time to develop the complex characters in multiple situations. One of the reasons the original series worked was because we got to see Lelouch and how dynamic and complex of a character he was. He wasn't just some edgelord with a superpower, laughing his ass off and destroying everybody in military conflicts. We got to see that when he wasn't doing that, he was putting on this face of a normal high school student. And it was the fact that Lelouch is kind of both his Lelouch Lamperouge personality and his Zero personality. The real Lelouch is somewhere in between those two. And so when we see him in each environment, we get parts of him. And we only ever really get to see the real Lelouch in very specific times when he's like by himself or when he's with C2, that we get to see the real Lelouch. And later, when he's with Suzaku, basically. And this applies to everyone in the series. Suzaku gets this treatment. Colin gets this treatment. Many characters get this treatment where we have time to see them not just being, in the case of Cornelia, for instance, we don't just see her being some psychotic murderer of Japanese people as she's introduced to be. And she does get introduced as very villainous. I got to say that. But almost immediately after that, we get to see her being this deeply caring sister who really does genuinely care about her sister, but is also very concerned about following the rules and having a code of honor. And then we later see that code of honor in battle, where she's not willing to sacrifice her men for her sake or for anyone's sake. And she's also very headstrong and arrogant in that she pushes into situations by herself. But she's also not unwilling to accept help. When Suzaku shows up, she's down with it, more or less. She has a little bit of hesitation, but she understands the reality of the situation. She's a complex character. She's not just one thing or another. And then she continues to develop throughout the series. Now, unfortunately, in Cornelia's case, a lot of her development seems to happen off screen for unexplained reasons between R1 and R2. Cornelia got a little bit of mistreatment in the series. But even her, as one of the weaker characters, is still a very strong character in the series. Colin is a particularly strong character, but I may end up talking about her later. I want to instead shift to talk about how the villains were almost, and in some cases, just as complex, charismatic, and compelling as Lelouch. The problem with Roze is that the big bad, Norland, is just an evil, empty, dead inside psychopath. There's nothing there as a person. He's not compelling at all. He's just some crazy psychopath, dead clone, right? But Lelouch had interesting foils at every level all the time, right? Cornelia was interesting foil to him because in the beginning, she served as this wake-up call to how naive he had been, right? She served as the first real military commander that he had to face. And then later, we're introduced to Schneisel. Lelouch is always very concerned about his father, Charles the Emperor, and so you might think that Emperor Charles is the big bad, but Schneisel's introduced as this kind of mysterious, enigmatic character that even today, people still don't have a complete read on. People still don't entirely know how to understand Schneisel as a character because he wears masks as effectively as Lelouch does, and we never get inside his mind. We only ever see the masks he's portraying. We don't ever get the insight to his mind. We don't ever see the real Schneisel, or if we do, we don't know when we're seeing the real Schneisel. He's just as complex as Lelouch. He's just as smart as Lelouch, and so he's an absolute amazing foil and a villain and a final villain for Lelouch to face as a protagonist. I mean, Sakuya and Ash are not nearly as compelling as Lelouch, so they don't have that benefit, but they also don't have any compelling villains that challenge them in any interesting ways, character-wise, narratively, or at all. In terms of the ace pilots, the original series started out kind of fairly grounded, where it wasn't about big mech better. It was really much about tactics. That's not entirely true because obviously the Lancelot is introduced in episode 2, and it is just the best mech. But there's always an element of tactics, right? And the ace pilots that we get on both sides, we get Colin on Lelouch's side and we get Suzaku consistently on the opposition side. They're both compelling, interesting characters to watch who we get to see their competence in and out of the nightmare frame as combatants, as warriors, but also their complexities as people. And again, we don't really get to see this. So, like, Haruka really never does fucking anything. But Colin is constantly doing badass shit. Suzaku is constantly doing badass shit. We understand that these characters are badasses, but we also get to spend time with them as people. And we don't get that with Haruka. The most we get is that something that happens in like episode 10 or 11 is that she backtracks on what she says in episode 1, where she says, the Britannians killed my family. And then in episode 10 or 11, she's like, oh, hey, by the way, Dad, how's it going? How have you been acting as our military commander the last 5 episodes? What's going on? Like, what? Which is it? The shit doesn't make any sense. We do not explore that at all. We do nothing with that. I also think that just fundamentally, the show starts at the wrong place. Like, the original series started at a good place. I can't really say it's a perfect place, because I'm biased and we have the benefit of retrospect. But the original series started at a good place for it to tell its story. There was a conflict that happened in the past, and it opens with C2 giving a narration to explain in very simple terms about what happened and to set the stage for this world. And then we open with a very small scale, understandable, personal narrative of following Lelouch and what's happening to him and him getting his powers. And then from there, we start to slowly expand out to understand more and more about the story. But with Roze, this is a sequel and a spin-off that takes place after the original series. And it takes place like 5 years after the original series. And a whole bunch of shit has supposedly happened in that time, including the takeover of like about 1/4 of Japan. Hokkaido seems to be a pretty large section of Japan up there at the top. We don't know exactly how big that block is as defined in the series. And all that shit happened off screen, basically. It is mentioned in the opening narration, but they don't really go into details about how it happened. And the reason that this matters, the reason it's different, is that with the original series, it was the original series. There was no background for this. They were setting the stage for the plot they wanted to tell. But now with the sequel series, they're trying to tell a story after another story has already taken place within the world, within the narrative. And that story is really important. And there's a lot of questions that story raises. And they just try to hand wave it away and say, well, it just happened. And it becomes increasingly difficult to believe as we learn more and more about how powerful and how evil Neo Britannia is. It becomes increasingly difficult to believe all of the things that they ask you to believe in this series. One complaint that people have about Resurrection is that they think that it retcons Lelouch's death, and they think it cheapens his death because there's no way for him to have a code. He should not be able to have a code in a Geass. And I mean, as far as the original series is concerned, that's kind of true. I mean, that's the established precedent that they set in the original series, is that nobody we see has a code and a Geass, and they say that you can't have both. But that's kind of the only thing Resurrection really asks you to believe on kind of just good faith, and that they don't try to explain in any significant way, is how and when exactly he got that code. But if you are a fan of the series, it's not that unreasonable to just assume he stole Charles's code in C's world. It's not explained. It is unprecedented, but it's not that hard to believe, and it's the only thing they ask of you in an otherwise amazing story. So I'm willing to accept that and to give that, especially because it's an alternate timeline. I'm willing to accept that. The problem with Roze is that it does that like every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, they ask you to accept some bullshit that does not make sense. And in return, they're giving you a horrible plot and dull characters. It does not balance out. Those scales do not work. And I think if they had started the plot somewhere else, it could have been much stronger. And so we go back to the 25 episodes. If this was a 24 or just approximately 20 episode series, we could have started the series way earlier. I don't know where exactly. I'll discuss it more in depth in my follow-up to this. But I think we should have seen in sequence, in parallel, Roze and Ash building up their reputations as mercenaries, while Norland and his crew are taking over Hokkaido. I don't think we should have started after those significant events, because we don't really understand what makes Roze so talented. I mean, we see that Ash is a talented pilot, and we see he has a very powerful nightmare, although we have no idea where that fucking nightmare came from. And we have no real understanding of how logistically Norland took over Hokkaido, and it doesn't actually make any sense. But if we spent time on that and didn't just hand wave it away, it may be more easy to believe these things, and we may be able to better develop these things. So I think starting at that point earlier would have been a better place to do this. In terms of character moments, kind of going alongside this, by the time the series starts, Roze and Ash are these like well-known mercenaries. But we don't know why. No one ever tells us specifically why. In the original series, when the series aired and Lelouch got his Geass and he killed those guys with it, I have heard that when that happened in theaters or wherever it aired, it got a standing ovation because of how awesome it was and because of how well built that episode had been. And obviously it is a very awesome moment. I wasn't in that room. But that's the story that I've heard. The original series is full of moments like this, and so is Witch from Mercury, which I probably will talk more about as we continue to discuss this. They're full of triumphant moments, profound speeches or profound lines, or just iconic moments that endear you to characters in significant ways. And I do not feel as if Roze has any of these. Nothing Sakuya or Roze ever do is truly iconic, and it all feels cheap because she's just trying to imitate Lelouch in ways that feel cheap, feel unearned, and do not really even make sense for her character. Because as I said in my last video, why does she have these theatrics? Where do those come from? Like, I don't understand those as a thing for her character. Whereas with the original series, we come to understand that that's very much just Lelouch being an overdramatic, arrogant motherfucker, right? He's in love with all of this shit. He is having the time of his life when he destroys Tokyo in episode 24 of the original series. He's having the time of his life when he starts laughing his ass off. We understand, but we don't really get that with Sakuya. There's just no moments that ever endeared me to these characters. And Roze and Sakuya were the best characters, along with Ash. The rest of these characters had nothing. Our supposed ace pilot, nothing. Our military commander, nothing. Norland, nothing. Catherine, nothing. Nothing to make me like or care about these characters. And that kind of just goes along with writing the compelling characters. I mean, part of the problem is that none of these characters have any complexity. So Lelouch was a complex character because he had a lot of conflicting motivations and goals. And to achieve what he wanted, he had to do things that he didn't necessarily believe in or that he wasn't necessarily comfortable with. And so he was constantly towing a line and figuring out really his own personality and his boundaries. You know, one of my favorite moments is episode 9, I think, The Messenger from Kyoto, where Lelouch, early in the episode, or about halfway through it, he meets with Kirihara of the Tokyo group, and Kirihara asks him, "Are you going to walk the path of blood?" And Lelouch very confidently says yes, because this was right after the battle at Narita. And then immediately afterwards, he gets a call from Shirley. He meets Shirley. Shirley's crying. It's raining. And she says, "My father has been killed. He was killed in the Battle of Narita. Zero killed my father." And Lelouch is fucked up about this, right? Because he realizes this is the path of blood that I just said I was going to walk. I didn't think it would affect me. I didn't think this would hurt the people that I cared about. And in this moment, he realizes that. Earlier, even earlier than that, Lelouch kills his half-brother Clovis. And he does it. It's an awesome scene, an awesome cut. And the next scene we get is him like throwing up in the sink. And him saying, "I guess I'm not as tough as I thought I was." Because he just fucking killed somebody. He killed his half-brother, shot him in the face, and walked out. Like, that actually did affect him in a meaningful way. So we see the humanity alongside the darkness. And these are some aspects of Lelouch, obviously, alongside his theatrics and everything. We don't get this with any of our characters, you know? There's nothing that makes Roze interesting or complex or conflicting. And the things that could have, which I thought they were going to explore, was her being even darker than Lelouch in some ways. Because, and this is why I say the series probably peaked in episode 2 or 3, because when we realized that Sakia had controlled Ash with her Geass, I thought that was a great thing. It's one of the 3 things I think the series does well that deserve to be in a better series. But we don't explore that, and we actually actively undo the consequences of it and any potential it might have had. We do nothing with it. And this happens for every character in the series, is that there's just nothing simply compelling about them, especially the villains, because they're so transparently, cartoonishly, unbelievably evil in a way that has never existed in this series. This series is full of complex characters. As I said before in my other video, Charles and Schneisel and these characters who wanted to control the world, dominate the world, change the world, were not doing it out of hate or any kind of shallow motivations. They may have been selfish, they may have been arrogant, they may have been biased, but they genuinely, to some extent, believed that they were doing the right thing for the world and for themselves and the people around them. And they had compelling reasons to do it. And they weren't trying to do something so blatantly evil. I mean, they were basically just trying to do different SMT Shin Megami Tensei alignment endings, right? Like, that's basically what they were trying to do. You know, Lelouch chose freedom and chaos. Schneisel wanted like law and order under threat of death. Like basically he wanted to be God. And Charles kind of wanted like neutral, nothing. Stop time, take away humanity. He wanted something inconceivable, right? Because he thought it would be better than humanity's current condition based on his experience. None of the characters in Roze have any of that. Norland is a clone of Charles, which is a terrible twist. Cloning comes straight out of some Japanese exclusive gacha game. And apparently, because he's a failed clone, he has some kind of hate or disgust for humanity. So he just wants to annihilate the species. That is awful. I mean, look, maybe you could write that in a different series. Or maybe you could write that at a different time with a different background plot. But you cannot go from a couple of Neo-Britannians took over a small section of Japan to this guy has created Loki bots, human blenders that deploy across the whole world, and his plan is complete global genocide and annihilation of the human race. You cannot do that. It does not work. It does not fit. It's terrible. And speaking of his kind of, his violence and his power and his genocide, none of that makes sense logistically. How is it that he was able to build so many of these things? I mean, I think if you pay attention to some of the scenes in the series, it seems like he was building these Lokis in the background. So we go from him kind of delaying production of the first Loki to somehow having thousands to millions of these things that can be deployed simultaneously across the entire world at the same time. And they are so effective that they can even give nightmares a run for their money. Like somehow they can also fight a nightmare frame. Where the fuck did he get the money or the resources to do this? He is like a small terrorist group in generously 1/100th of the world. And the entire world is united against him and everything he stands for. Who is funding this? Where does he obtain the power and the money to do this? It makes no sense. And that's not even counting the bullshit mech that he designs, right? I don't even care about that. It makes no sense logistically at all. And speaking of the Loki, they are the worst part of the series. They are the reason that this series went from like bland but otherwise inoffensive to completely disrespectful of the original series. So they just simply don't belong in the series at all. the original series had an understanding of the very careful balance of its tone between high school shenanigans and violent terrorism and war crimes, right? And war in general. And that's a careful line to walk, and I think that they did walk it. At no point in the original series did I ever think that the violence was gratuitous. Sometimes it could be, a little bit more than normal, like when Colin first gets her I'm losing the name of the weapon at the moment, but her claw weapon. God, I hate that I've forgotten the name of this at the moment. It'll come back to me in a couple minutes. But when she first gets that weapon, it is a little bit more violent than normal. And there's a couple other moments in the series that have a little bit of violence, more than the usual. But typically the violence is fairly tame, because it needs to maintain its tonal balance with the violence and pushing C2 into a fucking truck full of tomato sauce, right? These Lokis completely destroy that balance. The tone of the franchise has been sucked into a Loki and spit out as mist, right? That is literally what has happened, because these Loki should not exist alongside the other things happening in the series. And what's even crazier is both the excessive display of violence. Like, it would have been possible, I think, to do something like this. And I've heard Gundam does this. I've heard there's a thing in Gundam called bugs. But I suspect the bugs in Gundam are not nearly this violent. Their violence is probably a lot more heavily implied. And I can actually use a direct reference for this. I haven't seen the bugs. I should have looked that up. And maybe perhaps I will, and I'll edit it into this. But in Witch from Mercury, and this is a big spoiler for Witch from Mercury, so if you were concerned about watching that series, skip ahead about a minute or so. But in The Witch from Mercury, Suletta smashes a guy with a Gundam, and it's kind of a shocking moment because nothing that violent happened in the series. It's very violent. It's the most violent the series gets, and it's meant to be a shocking moment. There's a similar moment in the original Gundam 98 series where what's his name? I haven't watched much of the original series, so I forget his name. Steps on a guy with a Gundam. And in that moment, there's no blood. It's all implied violence, right? And I suspect that a lot of Gundam is that kind of implied violence with the bugs, because if they spent too much time and effort on the gratuitousness of the violence, it would destroy their tone and it would affect the series in a way they're not ready for. But The Witch from Mercury specifically had a point to make with that violence, right? It served a real narrative purpose. There's no narrative purpose to these Lokis because, ironically, everyone just kind of pretends like they're not there. Like, it's weird that they are here and they get so much focus on what exactly they're doing and how horrifying and terrifying existentially it is, and how little anyone gives a shit about it. No one ever even comments in the series about how psychotic these things are. They barely acknowledge them as out of the ordinary at all. Like, they just kind of accept this and they're like, yeah, whatever. And then when the series is over and they're dealt with, completely off screen, by the way, although I imagine they all shut down like drones hive mind because Norland's supposedly in charge of them. People are just like, yeah, whatever, no big deal. It happened. Now we're better. We've moved on. It's been a couple months. But these things would have turned millions of people into nothing. They're just gone. No evidence they ever even existed. And anyone who's left that survived would be completely fearful and full of PTSD and unwilling to walk outside because of the existential horror of what just happened. And the series has no even understanding of this. Like, it would be one thing if they acknowledged this and that was part of the narrative, but it's not. They pretend as if it's not even a thing. Alternatively, if they had deployed the Loki, but they didn't put so much violence on it, maybe the first time a Loki shows up, you see it so you understand what it does. But then from there, you don't see it again to an extent. But once they get introduced, the series seems to revel in this violence. It's as if the writers and the animators were taking joy in the violence of these things that simply don't belong in this series and that destroy the tone of the series. As far as I'm concerned, we need to throw Norland's character into a fucking Loki and just fucking start over, because that character has to go. It does not belong. throw him into the Lokis and then throw all the Lokis into each other until nothing's left. But I'll get more into that as I discuss character problems and then later what my ideas for reworking the series. And speaking of tonal shift, we're going to go from existential horror of human blunders to talking about fan service, because that's the next thing on the list. So Code Geass has a little bit of infamy for its fan service. But it's interesting because if you actually look at the fan service that exists in the series, there's really not that much of it. And the fan service that does exist exists primarily within like isolated places. Like probably the most gratuitous fan service is somewhere in season 2, where a lot of the girls at Ashford Academy are in the bath together. And so they're all just fully naked in the camera, and the animation is having a great time putting them on as much display as is legally possible to display, right? But all of that happens in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes of screen time. But that's a significant portion of the fan service that even exists in R2. There is actually not that much fan service in Code Geass in the original. And the fan service that did exist, especially in R1, R2 plays a little bit more loose and fast with this, but that's R2 in general, fast and loose with things. The fan service that exists in R1 generally serves some kind of narrative purpose, or it makes sense within the context of the story and the narrative at the very least. So, for example, the first major fan service I think that happens in the series is Colin in the shower at Ashford Academy. And there's nothing out of the ordinary about this. She's in the shower, so she's gonna be naked. That makes perfect sense. There's nothing unreasonable about that. And what they do with that scene, it does serve a narrative purpose, because the whole thing is her and Lelouch playing these games of trying to determine, well, Colin's trying to determine his identity, but he's trying to get her off his tail. And so in that moment, she forgets about the situation that she's even in. She's so focused on her mission of preserving her identity and figuring out who this guy is and what he knows, that she completely forgets the situation she's in, which is when Lelouch calls her out and she gets embarrassed. So that is fan service. It is there to, stimulate the audience, certainly. But it also serves to push the story and the character forward. And narratively, Lelouch and Colin did need to be alone for any of this to make sense, and the bathroom is a decent place for this to happen. Now, how much you want to drill down and argue whether or not it needed to happen, or if we needed to see certain angles, or whether or not you like fan service at all, is a whole different fucking discussion. But the point is that the fan service that exists in the original series is limited, it is reasonable, it is infrequent, it is tame, and most importantly, it exists alongside genuinely good characters and plots. And this is the critical problem in Roze. None of the fan service that exists here means anything, because these are all nothing characters. And the fan service is actually, ironically, worse in every possible way. So Colin, I've never met someone that does not like Colin, right? Everyone loves Colin. So the fan service for Colin works because people like Colin, right? And something I just don't understand in general is the idea that finding a character attractive or sexualizing a character somehow objectifies the character inherently or takes away from that character's value. This logic makes no sense to me, because people, presumably, I would hope, both respect and have sex with and sexual thoughts about and for their life partner. If you're married to someone, you respect them as a person, you appreciate them as a person, you also find them sexually attractive naked, and you want to fuck the shit out of them. These things are not mutually exclusive, and I do not know why we apply this kind of psychotic logic to anime. The reason the fan service works is because people like Colin as a person and as a character, so if you get to see her tits, it's a bonus. This doesn't happen in Roze because the characters are nothing. And the fan service is also egregious in all of the wrong ways, because it is too frequent. It is done at the wrong times, in the wrong places. Catherine's outfit never makes any sense. Yoko's outfit never makes any sense. the scene between a salty Walty, as another YouTuber calls him, Walter, and Sakura makes zero sense. In the moment, it makes sense because he appears to be an enemy catching her at a vulnerable moment. And in that moment, conceptually, contextually, it does make sense and it serves a narrative purpose. And it comes right after a perfectly reasonable fan service scene where she's just in the fucking bath. That is the most in line with the series for fan service. But the very next episode, when we learn that he's actually her ally who wants to serve her as her knight, that shit makes no sense. Because why the fuck would he do that? It's an unreasonable thing to do. And that's the entire series as far as fan service. And I know people meme about, Colin's ass shots in the series, but it actually doesn't happen that often. I think if you found all of the ass shots of Colin in the series, there would be about half as many over 50 episodes as Haruka gets in 12 episodes. And Haruka gets zero of the character development. She's not nearly as interesting of a character. It doesn't make any sense. It's all stupid fan service. We get stupid outfits, we get stupid scenes with no context, and we don't get shower scenes. We don't get bath scenes. We don't get that awesome moment where Colin's showering naked, Suzaku shows up, she fucking grabs her outfit, her knife, uses the outfit to both cover herself and the knife, and charges at this motherfucker. And Suzaku tackles her. A perfectly contextual moment that is fan service, but also serves a narrative purpose and is just another one of Colin's most badass moments, right? We don't get any of that here. The fan service in the series is terrible. And it actively takes away from so many scenes because when things are serious, especially when these fucking Loki show up, the fan service continues even after the Loki show up. Even when the seven shining stars are getting their asses kicked, Yoko's on screen next to Kensai and her tits are on screen. It just never makes any fucking sense at all. So with that said, I want to transition now to talking about specific problems with specific characters. And this is hardly an all-inclusive list because I'm certainly not going to talk about every fucking character in the show. And I certainly can't talk about every fucking problem they all have, but these are the major ones that stood out to me. So I'm going to start with Ash real quick. So I actually initially thought when he was Geass that he would be a more developed, kind of spun-on version of Rolo. And I thought that could be super interesting. But obviously, that's not what we got. But what we did get was this interesting situation where Ash is actually the most interesting developed character in the series because he has a compelling, good backstory that connects him personally to the villain. He has several solid motivations, mostly connected to that villain. He's the closest to Lelouch in that respect. He wants to get, revenge for a sibling, revenge on a parent or a surrogate parent. And as a character, he's well designed. Like the blue hair is just a nice flash. And Roze has a similar thing. Roze is a good design, but we'll talk about that. He's a solid design, and he has a good personality because he is a badass in the mech. But he's also very human in interesting ways outside of it. We get to see him in the brief moments we get of non-combat. Him have this personality of exercising, taking care of cats, defending people from bullies, but being socially awkward, developing this crush on a cute waitress, the things that he does, the lengths that he goes to talk to this person. And presumably this is all just who Ash is. None of this is really influenced by his Geass. And that's all really compelling. And I'll give him an additional point at the end of the series where he does a very noble self-sacrifice of saying, hey, you should Geass me again so that I'm the most capable fighter I could possibly be. He willingly wants to take on that Geass and self-sacrifice as a warrior to save the world. That's fucking dope. The problem is that the rest of the series sucks ass. So he's a good character in a horrible series. And that's unfortunate. And it also sucks because he's the only fucking character who dies. Of the whole fucking cast, the only good, interesting character in the cast is also the only one who fucking dies. Somehow Catherine makes it out. Nara makes it out. Arnold is probably dead, but we don't know for a fact that he's dead. Yoko makes it out. Kensai makes it out. Haruka makes it out. but Ash doesn't make it out. Fuck you. That's nonsense, right? So moving on to Sakuya. Sakuya is a complete waste of a character. And it starts early. As Roze, as I said in my original video, I had no idea that Roze and Sakuya were the same person. I had no idea Sakuya Sumeragi was in this series. I never looked into it. I was scared to look into the series because I didn't want to be spoiled. So I had no idea a Sumeragi was here, and I had no ability to predict that Roze would be a different character. The Roze design and personality are great, and I like them. The problem is introduced when it's revealed that she is actually Sakuya Sumeragi. And the first one is that her Geass is wasted in this series. She uses it the first time in an interesting way that I call the devil's deal, and I will refer to many times, where she gives someone a condition. If you do this thing, if you help the Japanese that you have hurt, you can live. But if you refuse, you will die. And this guy is such a shithead that he shoots himself in the head because he can't bring himself to possibly help a Japanese person. That's super interesting and compelling, and that could have been a great way to set her apart from Lelouch as a protagonist in a number of ways. But this gets dropped immediately. She never uses it that way again. From that moment on, she just uses it as an auditory version of Lelouch's power of absolute command. And so it raises the question, why did Lelouch never do it that way? And how can she do it that way? Why did she bother in that instance? And why does she never do it again? It doesn't make any sense. And the other problem is that her enemies are way more prepared to deal with her Geass than Lelouch's enemies were. I mean, basically none of Lelouch's enemies had any ability to deal with his Geass at all. But Sakuya's Geass is constantly being undermined by enemies who may not know what she's doing, but at least are more willing to shoot people who are acting weird. And so combined, it's not, I don't think that she's not smart or that the enemies are smart. I think it's just bad writing. Like, they just didn't know what to do with this. And Lelouch is constantly using his Geass in creative ways, like using the Geass on himself to outsmart Mao, using the Geass on Suzaku to set up this rest of the series long character arc that resolves in an awesome way. I mean, Lelouch is constantly using the Geass in creative ways, and Sakuya never is. Most of the time she uses the fucking thing, it's off screen. Her Geass never develops. She never uses it in any kind of climactic way or moment. It has no plot relevance because Lelouch and C2 are fucking nowhere to be seen after they give this to her, which is a whole different problem. It's like there was really no point of her even having the fucking thing. And half the people that she tries to use it on are just straight up immune to it. It's completely pointless. The chess game at the beginning is pointless. I think it was only there to demonstrate that she's kind of smart, but like logistically, it doesn't even make any sense. And how smart Sakuya is, I really have no concept of. I don't know how smart she is comparatively to anyone, because nothing she does is ever really that smart at all, to be honest, or that clever or that exciting to see. A lot of what Lelouch did was not necessarily the smartest thing in the world, but it was exciting in the moment in a way that helped you believe his intelligence. And at least you see him doing the groundwork with his Geass a lot of the time, or often enough that you could believe he was doing it if you didn't see it. And again, we just don't ever see Sakuya doing that. I also thought it was a shame that there could have been something interesting, which I didn't even know at the time of my first video, but I learned in recently doing this research for this video, that the Kirkwains, those redheads who were killing Japanese in the first video, were apparently the guys who chased Sakuya and Sakura down as kids. I missed this detail or I forgot about it. And so they have this deep personal connection to Sakuya. And in fact, I think they lived with them for a while. There's a deep personal connection between the Kirkwains and the Sumeragis. And yet they're the first two people dealt with, and neither of them get any real significant screen time or personality or development. That's a super shame. And I'll talk about that more in my next video because I have an idea for that. But I think more should have been done with that personal plot. You know, I mentioned it briefly, but I think Sakuya also doesn't really have anything compelling or conflicting about her. Suzaku, also Suzaku, but Lelouch was compelling because he had a bunch of conflicting parts about him. This innocent school personality he had to maintain, and a cold calculating zero that he had to maintain. And Colin, was constantly challenging both of them and threatening both of them to kind of untangle that web of lies. Sakia has nothing like this. I thought it would be the Ash plot, but that gets thrown out. Sakia is a perfect protagonist who does nothing wrong at any point, is completely in the right all the time, and ends up saving the world from a far greater threat. And then ultimately, she decides to do the stupidest thing in the world, which undermines her character and her intelligence entirely, which is that she uses the Geass on herself to seal her own Geass. And I think that alone is proof positive the writers of the series had no fucking idea what they were doing at all. Because there's no reason for her to do that. Lelouch's sacrifice served so many purposes, but one of the purposes was that he had walked this path of blood, the path of destruction, and from the very beginning he knew and he said and he'd always believed that the only people who should kill are those who are prepared to be killed. And he followed through with that philosophy to the very end. Even if he later came back, whether or not he knew he was immortal, we're not going to get into that. But he followed through with that philosophy. He was willing to die for a better world and for what he believed in. And he knew that what he did was wrong. And that's what sets him apart from Light Yagami, who he's often compared to, is that Light really thought he was God and did nothing wrong at any point. He was completely full of himself. The power got to him and corrupted him in an irrecoverable way. That never happened to Lelouch. He never lost his humanity. So he did horrible things, but he knew he was doing horrible things. He just believed there was a reason for it. So his sacrifice served a purpose as trying to offset those scales. That he had done this, and now there needs to be a consequence for him. And the series could have ended differently if certain things went differently. But in order for him to achieve his goal, he had to follow through, and the only way that he thought, and the best way that he thought this could happen, was for him to die. Sakia has none of this. Sakia does nothing wrong. No one dies as a result of her Geass. In fact, several people die as a result of her not using her Geass, which is hilarious in retrospect. And in fact, the only reason she was able to save the world at all and to be in a position to save the world from the greatest threat it had ever seen in Norland was because of Geass, right? So the idea of her Geassing herself as penance for something makes zero sense at all, as does her becoming Empress. But I'll talk about that in the next section. The last thing I wanted to say about her is also regarding the Geass. It's pointless because Geass cancelers exist. So if and when they want to wheel Sakuya out in the future for fan service, they can just hit her with a Geass canceler and it's fucking pointless. The writers have no idea what they're doing. This is a pointless thing to do in a world with fucking Geass cancelers. It can be undone in a heartbeat. So it is both stupid and pointless. Congratulations. In my last video, I said that Sakuya, or Sakura, was a regent of Hokkaido. I had forgotten, or just in the moment I had, had a brain fart, that she was actually installed as the actual empress of that area of Neo Britannia. But the reason I had forgotten is because it's completely irrelevant. It means basically nothing, as does her and Sakuya's bloodline relation to Charles Britannia at all. It's completely pointless. It means nothing. But functionally, I'm still correct in that she's really just a figurehead for the most part who's there to look good and to buy time for Norland's genocide plan. But the thing is that she's actually a more interesting character than Sakuya because she actually has a real arc. And her whole arc is this person who was meant to just be a bodyguard to the Empress is now thrust into the position of Empress and must learn how to wield her power in a responsible way. And she does exactly that. But her reward for it is becoming assistant to a mute Empress. That's fucking ridiculous. The most obvious, brain dead, obvious thing to do is for Sakura to become the actual Empress at the end of the series, because that's what she had been doing, and she earned that place. Meanwhile, Sakuya continues to be some kind of mercenary or Black Knight or something combat related because that's what she's been doing. It makes no sense for her to give up the mercenary life to become a mute Empress. It's ridiculous. And it reeks of Game of Thrones We know we've been building up to Jon Snow killing the fucking God, it's been so long. We know we've been building up to Jon Snow killing the king of the White Walkers for the whole series, but we want to subvert your expectations so bad we're going to have Arya do it. That's what it smells like to me. Is they're just trying to subvert your expectations because they're shitty writers that don't understand character development or foreshadowing, right? Catherine. All right. First thing you have to do. Fix her fucking outfit. It has to be fixed. She has to be wearing a real legitimate outfit that does not have the sides of her tits falling out. It's ridiculous. It takes away from her character. I cannot take her seriously. Get rid of it. Fix it. Once you do that, I don't think her character makes a lot of sense, and I don't understand how she earns her happy ending. She's completely complicit in all of this right up until like episode 10 or 11, where suddenly, Sakura asks her, like, what is strength? Or, like, here's my definition of strength. And then, even though she's probably like a 25 or 30-year-old woman who's been raised by Norland since she was fucking 5 or something, in this one moment, her whole worldview collapses. And in the course of like an hour real time and 2 episodes in the 12-episode series, she's honestly, nothing even happens. She just confronts Norland because she's still conflicted. She fights Norland, asks him what strength is. Norland spares her life for reasons I can't possibly imagine because he supposedly hates all humans, and she somehow survives the fall, probably because of how big her tits are. I have no idea. And then the next time we see her, she's trying to live a new life. Like, are you fucking kidding me? What was this character? Also, her constant overt trying to be sexy antics need to go. It's too much. I think they should have just had her be attractive and not lean into it. Again, this is something the original series did. All the female characters were super attractive, but none of them really flaunted that around like Catherine does. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't even align with this idea of strength that she's obsessed with. It has to go. Haruka. Haruka has to do something. Anything at all. She needs time. She needs 25 episodes. We need to see her as a person. We need to see her do things as a person and as a pilot, right? I don't think she ever even wins any nightmare duels. I don't even remember the name of her nightmare. I don't remember it doing anything cool. I remember nothing about her other than her purple hair, her ass shots, the sudden reveal that her father is alive at the 11th hour, and the fact that she does nothing. Remove 3/4 of her ass shots and give her a shower scene instead. And for the love of God, give her something to do that is meaningful. Let her win some battles, please. Yoko. Fix her outfit, give her personality. End of notes. Norland. Nothing about this character works. Throw him into a Loki. Start over. Cloning is a dumb plot point from a Japanese-only gacha game. It should not be canonized in the official series. Also, Norland. So a lot of people said Resurrection shit on Lelouch and his legacy. I disagree with this vehemently because it was naive to think that Lelouch would implement world peace for everlasting. It makes sense that there would still be conflicts after Lelouch he does the Zero Requiem. And the premise of Resurrection is that there is one nation in the world that Britannia never managed to conquer, which is not unrealistic because Britannia only ever conquered 1/3 of the world. And this is a militarized superpower that has been protected by the power of Geass. Nothing about this is unrealistic. And it's not as if Shamna and her brother are trying to dominate the world. Actually, the Black Knights and C2 are infiltrating their territory. They are sneaking into enemy territory, into someone else's homeland, and assaulting their homeland. It is perfectly reasonable for Shamna to fucking defend herself. All right. Now, to be fair, I guess, they did kidnap Nunnally at the beginning, so that's why this is all happening. But again, that nothing about that by itself really violates the peace or anything, right? Like Suzaku points out that they're breaking the peace, but it would be unrealistic. Someone was always going to break the fucking piece, right? It's not unrealistic that the piece is broken. And nothing that happens in Resurrection is Lelouch's fault. His goal was never to conquer this nation. And he really didn't even know this fucking nation existed. Nobody did, as far as we know, right? And it doesn't matter. That wasn't the point. They never mattered. They didn't do anything. But in this series, in order for this series to make sense, there have to be a couple of contrivances that start with Lelouch being emperor, or even before that, actually. The first one is that Charles built Norland at all using cloning technology, which doesn't make any sense. I don't know why Charles would do this. And I don't know why Charles would leave Norland alive after he got his code and once his plan was working. So it makes no sense for Norland to exist or to have survived into the reign of Emperor Lelouch. It does not then make sense for him to stay hidden and survive during the reign of Emperor Lelouch. If this guy was a fucking Knight of the Round, where was he in Season 2 with all of the other Knights of the Round? Basically, all of the other Knights of the Round showed up, even if they were like a 12-second cameo that got off by Suzaku in that battle, right? All the other fucking Knights of the Round showed up. Where was Norland? How is it that Lelouch was emperor and he never asked, where is the Knight of Five? Where is Norland von Lunenburg, right? And how did he not uncover Charles's plan? He's the Emperor of Britannia that has everyone in it under his complete absolute obedience by the power of Geass. How does he not uncover Norland's identity, his location, the plot with Charles, and wipe this motherfucker off the planet? Lelouch would have put this guy in the ground, and I can only conclude that in the original canon, where Lelouch does die, that's exactly what he did. He put Norland in the ground. That or he never existed at all. But because he did not, everything that happens in Roze is a direct result of Lelouch's inaction or inability to stop Norland and his bullshit, right? And because he is a clone of Charles, it is an even more direction because this is an extension of his father. This series and Norland's character actively shit on Lelouch and his legacy. It is insulting. Throw it all out. He should have no connection to Charles, no connection to Lelouch at all. It can't happen. Brief note on some of the OG characters. Cornelia is acting 100% out of character. Cornelia is arrogant and self-righteous. Those are like her two most defining character traits, right across from being chivalrous and honorable alongside her self-righteousness. There's a fine line she walks with those two things. In this series, she is stupid and somehow humble. This makes no sense. The scene of her saying, well, they got us because racism, is a joke. Cornelia would never accept this. For that matter, nobody in the Black Knights would. But Cornelia especially would not accept this. The Black Knights, all of them, every single one of them, especially the new ones they introduce, all of whom are nothing characters that should also be thrown into Loki's, they're all completely pointless, incapable, and they should not be here. I don't like any of them. I have some suggestions about them in the next one, but they shouldn't be here. Nina is actually perfect. Don't touch Nina. Nina's perfect. Precious has done nothing wrong, just like always. Nina is perfect. Precious. She was somehow the only character they got right. Akito and his friends and the Oz cast should be more than brief cameos. And for that matter, so should Lelouch, or so should Suzaku and Colin. They need to be introduced earlier. Again, I have more ideas for this in the next video. But I don't think that they should just be glorified like 20-second cameos. It's insulting, especially in a series this bad. It's even worse because the series is bad. Now, I want to specify the three things that I think the series could have done well, the three things of potential it had, and they all center around Sakuya's Geass, because the series is called fucking Code Geass. Sakuya's Geass being a Devil's Deal type thing had a lot of potential. And they should have done something with it. They did not. Ash being under that Geass, an enemy turned ally, or at least a neutral party turned ally, is interesting because that's exactly the shit the Black Knights accused Lelouch of doing that he never did. So seeing that play out would have been interesting. And then finally, Ash actually asking to be put under the Geass again after it was canceled to help save the world. That's a great character moment. But all of them are squandered by being in a terrible show. And the last thing I want to say in this video, thanks for sticking with me so far, but I imagine if you're still here, you feel exactly the same way that I do, and you are reveling in the hate and the rage. The last thing I want to talk about is the fact that people themselves, the audience of this show, I just don't understand. I think people have no standards, and they have unreasonable expectations on both sides of this, right? And I mean in terms of what is good and what is bad. People have just I cannot comprehend. It is incomprehensible. I am baffled by the amount of defense that I see for this show. People saying that it is not bad or pretty good are both unreasonable ways to describe this show. It is an objective failure on basically every metric. This show does basically nothing right or correct. And so I can't understand how people, I kept seeing this in the Reddit threads. Every episode, people said, pretty good, 7 out of 10. No matter what happened, no matter how bad it was, no matter how bad the writing was, it's as if people are putting no thought into this. It's as if people actually have the magical ability to turn off their neocortex and their ability to think critically and to simply consume media like companies want us to be, mindless consumers, because that's what this is. This is a pointless product to be consumed by the mindless masses. I do not know how anyone can like this. I am especially shocked and offended by people who claim to be fans of Code Geass and then turn around and say that this series is good or not bad, and then ask genuinely stupid questions like, who is better, Valletta or Catherine? That is an insulting question. It is especially bad when those same people turn around and say, Roze good, Resurrection bad. That is a brain rot, brain dead, psychotic take. If you think that, you have zero media literacy. I had someone try to tell me that in the original series, Lelouch did not use his power of Geass on C's world or on the will of God, or in some way his Geass did not affect that scene. Now, if you want to drill down into the semantics of what it means to use your Geass on somebody, I can get how he might disagree with the semantics of that. But you cannot watch that scene in Japanese or English and tell me that Lelouch did not use his Geass and apply that power toward God. That's exactly what he does. In the narrative, in the writing, in the wording, in the things that the characters say, and in the visuals. You see the icon of his Geass appear in the sky of C's world right before the exact thing he asked God to do happens. To be fair, he does not command God to do anything, but that's an acknowledgement by the characters. This is not a command. This is a request to God. Please do not stop the march of time. And what happens? The march of time does not stop. And at the exact same time, his Geass awakens to its final form in both eyes. And some crazy motherfucker tried to tell me that I did not understand the scene because I had not watched it in Japanese, even though the Japanese subtitles in English are beat for beat the same thing. Almost word for word, and it doesn't change the visuals of what's happening at all. I do not understand how someone can watch Code Geass and be so media illiterate as to say stupid shit like that, and then also possibly turn around and say Roze good, Resurrection bad. People have no standards, no media literacy. I don't understand it. If you tell Sunrise that you like this, that you thought that this was good, then that's what we're going to get. We're going to get more of this, more terrible writing, more underdeveloped characters, more clash of tone, more actually shitting on Lelouch's legacy, which you claim to not like Resurrection for doing, even though it doesn't do when this show actively does it. So it is insulting to me that there are so many people who enjoy this and just say, turn your brain off. And I think there probably is place in the world for media that can be consumed that way. But Code Geass is not that media. Code Geass should never be mindless robot violence. And I can only comprehend that the people who like this show are only here to see giant robots punch each other. Because there's nothing else. If you want giant robots fighting each other, then certainly you will get that in this show. But if that is the only thing you want out of a series, please go watch something else. Because Code Geass should be and was more than that. And I do not want Code Geass to become, if they really do have this 10-year plan, I do not want 10 more years of Roze of the Recapture.